Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back talking about The Last of Us. What is a very late review of The Last of Us Season 2, but again, I was kind of busy with Survivor 50 and 48 stuff. But either way, we're finally here doing a review of The Last of Us Season 2, a season that was just kind of okay to me, where I'm obviously someone that, again, I adored The Last of Us, and Last of Us 1 is probably my favorite game of all time. Last of Us 2 is also very high up there, and however, I have been extremely critical of the TV show. I did not particularly love Season 1. I felt like it just felt like an inferior version of the original story told, and with Season 2 here, I largely feel the same, where really, I feel like a lot of the complaints with Season 2 here kind of follow in the same trajectory as Season 1. It just feels like a lot of things were not adapted in a way that I personally preferred. Not saying it's fundamentally bad, as I do think if you're someone that hasn't played the game, these changes probably don't bother you, or again, you generally just like them better. But I do think for the most part, for me personally, as someone that was very attached to the games, they did at the TV show did not improve upon the story in my mind. Mind you, with that being said, I do think I give some grace to Season 2 here, in the sense that, I mean, one, obviously the story isn't fully done yet, as obviously, again, this is really only the first half of Part 2, while also, I do feel like it was just a difficult task to adapt Part 2 to begin with. And to be honest, that transitions into probably the bigger complaint of the season as a whole, and the fact that, like, why does this exist outside of making money? Where, again, I think with Last of Us 1, it felt like a story that, again, can be adapted to the television medium. Again, it's a fairly linear story. It's one that, while I do think it benefits from it being a video game and you connecting more to the characters, it's not one that is fundamentally a video game. Unlike Part 2, I don't think the point of the game and the way that it's able to realize its themes are very much entrenched in the fact that it is a video game and playing with the tropes of the video game medium. And I think with that being transitioned to the TV medium, again, to me, it just felt kind of pointless. It felt like something that, again, just fundamentally should not work. And I feel like they have obviously made changes to try to make that work for a TV show, but for me, it just comes off largely shallow in the sense that I just don't know why this exists outside of just making money. As I do think they're clearly changing the vision of the original story to adapt to the TV medium in a way that I personally just feel like it comes off less impactful by the end. Now, I should mention that this video will be very spoilery for the game. Again, this will be a video mostly based around the context of me being, again, a massive fan of the game, talking about the correlations between it. So again, I will likely be spoiling things for things that will probably happen in seasons 3 and 4, which, by the way, why are we getting 4 seasons for this? But either way, I'll still be running through season 2 from beginning to end, going episode by episode, starting it off with episode 1, which starts off with the cargo line from season 1 right away in the previously on, which is, again, such a great sign for the season. But anyway, we end up re-showing the I swear moment from the end of last episode, only to see Ellie awkwardly walking away from Joel following this, which I do question, like, why was I didn't need to see this? Again, not a bad scene, but just I don't want to, again, just feeling like the show feeling like it needs to show you things in a spot where I don't feel like they're necessary. But either way, we then cut to a giraffe eating in what is clearly Salt Lake City, and what is clearly just set up to the Abby storyline, which is so weird that they did this, where we see right away Abby's group in front of a whole bunch of graves with firefly pendants on it, with them obviously doing this setup to Abby's storyline right at the beginning here, instantly introducing us to the fact that she is a firefly connected to the group at the hospital, which I, again, do question if this is the right choice here. I get what they're going for, as obviously, again, in the TV medium. I do think having Abby just be this very mysterious character the entirety of it, and then later revealing this a season later feels a bit strange, but at the same time, I do feel like having Abby's motivations known from the very beginning kind of takes away the point of the game. Again, the point is that you're supposed to be looking at Abby as a very black and white character, and come to realize that's obviously not the case. Where I feel like the fact that we are seeing from the very beginning here this very sympathetic backstory for Abby, the fact that Joel killed someone very close to her, just feels like a misguided approach to me. And again, it's not fundamentally bad, especially with how the TV show is trying to portray its story. I just feel like for me, again, it definitely does lessen the impact of what this story is meant to be about. Though that being said, though, we obviously see Abby being portrayed here by Caitlin Dever, who I do think really knocks out of the park with her role here in a spot where I did have a lot of faith in Caitlin Dever as an actress. However, I did have some questions over the fact that obviously we see Abby not being muscular like she was in the game, which I also don't particularly like that they took that away. Again, I felt like that was something that, while again was more so added into the game for gameplay reasons, I do think they later baked it into the story as this showing even more so that Abby is so motivated to kill Joel that she transformed her entire body. And I do think, again, not having that here takes something away from the character, but still, as a whole, again, I did think Abby's portrayal in the show here was, again, mostly solid, even though it felt like a slightly different Abby than what we got in the game. But anyway, we then cut to 5 years later with Ellie fighting a guy in a barn. Again, we obviously see right away no future days scene, with that being saved for later in the season. And just in general, obviously they end up very much messing with the timeline of everything here, where the entirety of episode 1 is either stuff that was shown in flashbacks in the main game or just entirely new content, which again, I get it for a TV medium. I do think this is actually probably the correct choice of how to handle this. But again, this scene's here, obviously the show Ellie's violent nature again, which I just find to be a very strange characterization of Ellie. And I complained about this in season 1. I do feel like this continues on in season 2. The fact that they are making Ellie this like inherently violent person just really ends up lessening the impact of her later actions. Where again, I feel like the drastic actions that she take, get revenge on Joel later in the story, just feel like something she would just normally do anyway, instead of something that was really spurred on her by Joel's death. And through that, I think it lessens the impact of Joel's death, and also just lessens the impact of later scenes that we end up seeing. But anyway, it ends up being combat training, with it being revealed that she's being trained by Jesse, who is played by young Mazzino here, who I thought was a perfect casting choice coming into this. And I do think he plays Jesse pretty well. And in general, I actually felt like Jesse was pretty well portrayed in the show, in a spot where I think that's one of my bigger criticisms of The Last of Us Part 2, is I feel like some of the side characters are just simply not fleshed out well enough. And I feel like Jesse's actually someone that is given a lot more depth in the show. And again, in a spot where I do typically struggle to give much credit to things the show does differently, I do feel like the portrayal of Jesse and a certain character we're about to be talking about, I think was done a lot better. But again, we end up learning that this is the day of the New Year's Eve dance, which is obviously the dance sequence from the game, which is what this entire episode ends up leading up to, where that was a scene done towards the end of the game. This was done at the beginning. Yeah, it's a change here, but one I don't really have any gripes with. But with that, we then cut to Joel working construction, where we're introduced to Dina, who is there for some reason that's never explained. But Dina, like Jesse, again, I thought was given more depth in the show here. I think there are, again, some changes that you could debate if they were necessarily good or bad, but I do think, again, there was at least an attempt to give her more to do in the show, and I also feel like she's portrayed pretty well here by Isabella Merced, who I do feel like, while, again, she does give a bit of a different energy to the character than that of the original, I did overall find her performance here to be probably one of the better ones of the season. But it is in the scene, though, that we do end up seeing Joel and Dina being extremely close here, and Joel calling her kiddo, and showing Joel, like, teaching Dina things, which, again, I think is clearly meant to, like, parallel Joel's idealistic relationship with Ellie, and I think is also done here to give, like, Dina more motivation for wanting revenge for Joel. But I do find this dynamic to be a bit strange, considering it doesn't really lead to much, especially because by the end, Dina ends up kind of giving up on her wanting revenge for Joel anyway. But I will also say it is strange that we get introduced to Dina here through her relationship with Joel over her relationship with Ellie, which is also, again, something I'll nitpick there. But again, it does lead to talk about Ellie and how fractured Ellie and Joel's relationship is, in a spot where, again, I feel like the writing here was a bit blatant. Him literally saying that I know I'm a hard ass and I'm overprotective, which is like, yeah, thank you for telling me that, Joel. Well, at least him also talking about going to therapy, which is like, again, I guess, I mean, again, this is a different Joel than that of the game. I think the Joel in the game, I think the fact that he is relaying everything he knows to Tommy, I think it makes a lot more sense in the game, while I feel like in the show, again, him having a therapist, fine, I guess. Again, not a major complaint there, but just a spot where, again, I definitely feel like this is something that would be something more exclusive to the TV show version of Joel than the game version. But anyway, we then cut to Tommy teaching Ellie how to snipe, which again is them like kind of mixing in some flashback sequences here. Very strange considering like in the game this happens like a few years before this. Yeah, this is happening like right before the main events. But anyway, it just leads to Ellie convincing Tommy to put her on patrol, and more blatant talk about how Ellie and Joel are the same person. You know, again, that's clearly not what the original intention of the game was supposed to be, and also is even really the intention of the show by the end of it, where I think they clearly set up this like differentiator between how Ellie and Joel end up handling things, which just makes you question like, again, why is this like comparison between do such a major reoccurrence in the show? Anyway, we then get a conversation between Joel and Maria about how they're running out of space in Jackson, and really just leads to, again, more blatant talk from Joel about how you have to look after your own first, because we needed more characterization of that. But this ends up being like one of the few scenes Maria's even in this entire season where I feel like Maria just gets kind of shafted in this season, which, to be fair, again, she was barely in the game as well. But again, it really feels like she has nothing to do on the season itself. But that's when we cut to Joel going to therapy, with, I guess, there being one therapist in all of Jackson, that being Gail, played by Catherine O'Hara, which it felt like they wanted to use a lot of Catherine O'Hara. She just randomly shows up at points in the season. But again, new character here, and one that I personally just find very unnecessary. I feel like she's largely used in the story here just to tell us things, and in a spot where those things should not be told to us. It should be just kind of apparent. But anyway, she also ends up being the wife of Eugene, a character from the game that they obviously have to expand on, because obviously, with us getting mention here of Joel having killed Eugene, and that she knows that he had no choice and that she should forgive him. but can't because of how you did it, which is blatantly telling us the themes of the entire season, which is so stupid. Anyway, we get Joel talking about his relationship with Ellie, which just felt like more exposition here, just trying to catch us up on what has happened over the last few years without blatantly showing us like we end up getting in episode 6. But and we get Joel getting very emotional and saying, I saved her before leaving, because that's the thing he does. But anyway, we then get a pretty lengthy sequence here of Ellie going on patrol with Dina, happening the day of the dance instead of the day after, where again, they're kind of mixing things up here. But again, playing a very similar role of introducing us to the Ellie and Dina dynamic, using a lot of the same dialogue as in the game, with this patrol weirdly being led by Kat, who again in the game is mentioned as Ellie's ex. Though, again, was an unseen character there, but obviously they had to show her in the game because, again, obviously. But we see them finding a trail of blood leading to them a supermarket, which, again, is a set piece from the game. And, again, it's just kind of a fine scene here. Though, again, some decent characterization for Dina, showing her being, again, more methodical than Ellie. And I do think does a lot to differentiate Ellie in a spot where, again, I did feel like in the game, it just kind of felt like two sides of the same coin. But this does lead to our first interaction with a stalker, which I guess Jax has never seen before for some reason. But, again, a big action sequence here. Ellie kills the stalker. I found this kind of boring. It does lead to a short scene of them at the council where they get upset at them for not following orders. Well, again, no, this really matters. At this point, we do then cut to our first interaction between Joel and Ellie, taking place in the garage, where we get a lot of talk about her guitar. And I was thinking this was going to lead to the Future Days scene, but instead it just leads to Joel saying that he's going to put new strings on her guitar, and again, I thought that might lead into something reminiscent of the Finding Strings chapter, but no, it just leads to them showing Joel still caring about Ellie, which, again, I never would have guessed that. But again, obviously showing the tension between the two here. Again, very strange that we don't get this until, like, the end of the episode. But anyway, we then get to the dance scene, which, again, is pretty faithfully recreated from the game. Really no notes here. It's a good scene. Again, culminating in, obviously, Ellie and Dina's first kiss, and Seth making a homophobic comment, and Joel stepping in to protect her, and her being pissed about that. To which we then end the episode with Ellie walking home, seeing Joel on the porch, which made me very worried we were going to get the porch scene here, which would have been very strange to have in the premiere, especially considering it's like literally the last scene of the game. Though instead she walks by him in a spot where I saw a lot of people being very worried that they just weren't going to show the porch scene, which is like, I don't know how you thought that was going to happen. Like, I just feel like the porch scene is, again, so integral to the story that there's no way they weren't just not going to show it. But ultimately, the episode does end with a shot of Abby's group arriving, because I never would have guessed that she would have played a factor on this season. But then we get to episode 2. What I probably think is the best episode of the season for me personally. At least the episode that I had the least amount of gripes with. But anyway, it all starts off with an Abby dream sequence, which again is kind of from the game, of her walking through the hospital after her father's death, in a spot where we see her older self talking to her younger self, which again, like, why? But also it's like, again, if you are going to reveal this early, it's like, I don't really have a major issue with this scene. But anyway, she ends up waking up into Overlook, again, similar scene from the game, talking to Owen about what they're going to do, with Owen revealing to her that he has a plan, only for her to leave to take watch, and Owen to then reveal his plan is to actually convince Abby to go back, which I don't hate this. Again, obviously ends up showing Abby as more obsessed than the rest of her group, showing Abby in particular as the one that's too far gone, which again, I think is good on paper. I don't love that's happening now. And again, this is another thing of just changing the original game's intention. The fact that while they do some characterization between Abby and Owen early on in the game, I still feel like we're meant to be looking at Abby and Owen as these like monsters by the end of this opening sequence. So that is meant to motivate us to also find Abby's group once we get to the Ellie portion of the game. However, I feel like this in particular is a moment that, again, makes this all just fall into Abby in the spot where, again, it feels very clear the rest of her group are simply just not as motivated to go on with this, which ultimately, again, is a minor gripe here. I just feel like it's another thing that just feels like it lessens the impact of what the original story is meant to be. But we then cut to Ellie now being awakened by Jesse, which, again, very similar to the scene that we saw in the game where they're going out for patrol, but this time she actually goes out on patrol with Jesse instead of going with Dina, which, again, fine. I mean, again, showing the Ellie-Jesse relationship, allowing for Dina to go with Joel, which I guess adds more motivation for Dina as a character. And I did like seeing Ellie here, again, talking about actually wanting to go on patrol with Joel, again, feeling foreshadowing, obviously, to the fact that, yes, her and Joel did make up somewhat the previous night. Anyway, we see them going on patrol in the middle of a storm, which, again, conveniently happens a lot on this season, taking shelter in what ends up being Eugene's spot farm, which, again, is in the OG game, but obviously it was with Dina, and this leads to Ellie and Dina's first hookup in a spot where obviously that's not here in the game, which obviously leads to them taking Ellie and Dina's relationship a lot slower, which I actually don't hate on paper. Again, conceptually, that is fine, considering, again, this is a TV medium. I think there's more room to slowly progress that relationship than in a game, where, again, in a game, it would just feel obtrusive to the story trying to be told. But following that, we then get some focus around Abby, who ends up noticing two people on horses on the path below and ends up trying to follow them, which, again, leads to a very similar action sequence here to the game of her end up sliding down the hill and being followed by a horde, and this leading to really a lot of the rest of the episode being this massive action sequence with Abby eventually being rescued by Joel, which, again, how convenient, which that's the criticism of the game as well. Again, Dina being with Joel here instead of Tommy, Dina being the one to reveal Joel's name, which, fine. Again, obviously, this is a criticism of the OG game. The fact that, again, Tommy and Joel wouldn't be telling Abby's group their names. That feels unrealistic. While here, it's like, again, a spot where Dina just reveals Joel's name more accidentally, which, fine. Like, I thought the original criticism of it was dumb to begin with, but again, I guess they felt like they need to go out of their way to fix it, so fine. But again, this horde ends up leading to a very lengthy action sequence at Jackson, which, again, I get that the show feels like they need to do this, having these big action set pieces, though I personally found a lot of this very boring. Mind you, I get what they're doing narratively, and again, I do think narratively, this ends up working out pretty effectively, increasing the weight of Joel's decision, because obviously, again, if Joel end up sacrificing Ellie, this horde wouldn't be around, theoretically. But again, it's a spot where he's probably spent like a fourth of the episode on this set piece of them just killing infected and Tommy just running around Jackson and him defeating a bloater on his own, which all just felt very ridiculous and really just felt like the main motivation for why Tommy isn't with Joel when he dies, just so he could be here in Jackson. And I get the fact that, again, he doesn't need to be there during the scene to be motivated to go after Joel's killer, but at the same time, I do question how many of these decisions were made simply just to have a big action sequence in the show. But either way, we then get to the big moment where Abby, Joel, and Dina arrive at the Overlook, with Dina noticing the WLF patches, and Abby says everyone's names for some reason, again, making it very obvious that they're doing this to have Dina have information on the group. But either way, we see all their faces drop when Abby reveals that he's Joel, which leads to this starting off very similarly to the OG game of shooting Joel in the leg, though in this case, we see Abby telling him that he's pretty handsome, in case you need to know that. But again, I thought this was still a strong scene. Not as good as the original, though again, I think Caitlin Dever's performance here was pretty strong. Though again, I really don't love her massive monologue she ends up giving, like fully explaining everything, just openly talking about how Joel killed her father. Which again, I get the notion that Abby would want to gloat to Joel in this spot, but I do think the fact that we're actually being shown this just feels a bit over the top. And it just felt like them, again, over-explaining Abby's motivations, which again just felt very weird to do so this early in the story. And speaking of this early in the story, I'm a tad surprised they killed off Joel this early in the story. Obviously, I actually do think that was the correct call. I think it actually leads to his death having more impact, where, again, had it been towards the end of the season, I think you would have expected it more. I think for him to die in episode 2 is something that, again, is a pretty brave choice, and again, was a brave choice in the game, and I feel like they end up paying that off in the show relatively well. And also, again, a bit bold to kill off Pedro Pascal very early on the season. Obviously, a spot where, again, he is the biggest star coming into this show, and for them to be willing to drop him so early in the season, obviously, again, he makes future appearances, but still, it's like, it was a pretty big shock to see them not really milk him for what he's worth, which I'll at least give them credit for not doing that, I guess. But ultimately, again, Ellie ends up finding them, and we get a very similar death scene here, just with less people in Abby's crew, which, you know, obviously I get, considering, again, there were a lot of characters there that simply just didn't matter in the OG, to where, again, I get, like, narrowing it down to just those that do matter. But also we get a slightly different final death here in the fact that Abby ends up killing him by stabbing him with the club instead of bashing him with it, which, like, fine, I guess. Though I will say, I did think this is kind of silly to see Ellie just like crawling towards Joel immediately afterwards. And also, I just feel like it has less impact than the game. I think in the game, I think having that piercing noise play in the moment Joel dies and us cutting the black soon afterwards, again, just felt a lot more impactful to me than this. Of just like Ellie slowly crawling to him and hugging him, which I just felt a bit ridiculous to me. But anyway, the episode ends up ending with Through the Valley playing, sung by Ashley Johnson, which again was using the original trailer for the game, which was a nice callback there. Oh, we see them riding back to Jackson with Joel's body in tow, which again, a pretty sorrow final scene here. But then we get to episode 3, which I know got some flack for being just like a long setup episode. Yeah, I just felt like it was largely fine for the most part. Where again, this just feels like something that again kind of needed to be here from a TV medium. Anyway, we do start off with a scene at the morgue with Tommy confirming Joel's body and says, "Give Sarah my love," because they wanted to have an emotional moment, I guess. And then we cut from there to Ellie screaming as she wakes up if you didn't know she was traumatized by this, which I will say, this is obviously like a change from the game. At least like in the game, we don't really see her spending any time in a hospital or anything following Joel's death. It's never made clear exactly how much time passes between Joel's death and when she heads up for Seattle. Well, here we get the reveal that it's 3 months later, and we see her finally leaving the hospital, which again, I guess she's there because of the mental impact that she had on her. It feels weird they spent 3 months on that, but anyway, she ends up talking to Gail as she leaves, talking about the last time she talked to Joel, clearly lying about it, not mentioning the porch scene in a spot where I find it very funny that people legitimately came out of this still thinking the porch scene wasn't happening, especially considering we later get a following scene of Gail talking about how Ellie is a liar, which should have made it even more obvious. But anyway, we see Ellie go back to Joel's home, where again we get a similar scene to the OG, her finding Joel's watch and revolver, but we get an added aspect of her going to his closet and hugging his jacket and crying, which, yeah, fair. I mean, sure. Again, was it necessary for me? Not really. Again, I get why it's here. Anyway, this is followed by Dina arriving and giving Ellie cookies. Because it's a peace offering, where obviously we get Dina revealing that she knows the group that killed Joel and reveals Abby's name, with Ellie repeating it immediately afterwards, which again clearly showed her being kind of obsessed with it. But again, we see them trying to now convince Tommy to help them get revenge. But again, us getting similar dialogue here between Ellie and Tommy's conversation in the game, though in this spot, Tommy ending up being more hesitant. In a spot where, again, in the game, Tommy is the one to go without permission first. On this spot, again, he's more reactive. We see Ellie and Dina going first and Tommy going after them, which again is a change that I don't hate. I don't think it's necessarily like a bad choice here. It's one that I do think they did some work here in setting it up. Obviously, again, with the Horde attack the previous episode, it at least gives them a justification for why they don't go for revenge right away. Also, justification for the rest of the town to not go for revenge is, again, clearly they need to rebuild their own community first. And again, I at least get that notion. But again, we do get some focus here around the council vote, with the reveal now that Jesse's become part of the council, I guess. Feels kind of young to be on the council, but whatever. Anyway, gives Ellie advice to organize her thoughts and write them down, cutting to the next morning where we get the council meeting, with them proposing an idea of sending 16 of their top men to hunt down Joel's killers and exact vengeance, which, again, I do question why 16? Like, you're hunting down 5 people. It's like, do you really feel like you need 16 to do that? But again, clearly there's mixed support here, with some saying that they're meant to forgive and not hold grudges, all while Seth is on board, wanting revenge and wants to make a statement, where, again, when Seth's on board, that's clearly not a good sign. I feel like that's clearly the intention of this scene, is that, again, Seth is someone that we're introduced to in a not positive way, introduced literally as a homophobe, and again, later gets shown as incompetent, to the point where, again, the fact that Ellie is siding with Seth in this argument here is clearly telling us that, again, this is not the right choice to be making here. Again, Ellie ends up giving a passionate speech about not wanting revenge, but justice, which is clearly bullshit. But again, they ultimately don't care, as the council shuts this down anyway, which again was kind of humorous, but again, expected, obviously, because you need Ellie and Dina to go off without this approval. But it's funny that we get a very weird scene of Gail watching a Little League baseball game for some reason. Again, we see Tommy end up asking about Ellie, with more talk about Ellie and Joel are the same because they're both liars. Says that some people can't be saved. But again, at least us cutting to Ellie now preparing to go to Seattle on her own to kill Abby without a plan, outside of wanting to kill her using Joel's revolver, which, fine, I guess. But again, obviously all this like characterizing Ellie in a way that, again, just comes off as very reckless. But anyway, she ends up getting a knock on the door from Dina, who wants to go along with her and creates an actual plan. I never would have guessed that. And also reveals that they have a guy helping them, which turns out to be Seth. I can't believe it. Again, another sign this should be a very bad idea. Obviously, they end up going on their own in a spot where we end up seeing Ellie stopping by Joel's grave, 10 miles out of town, which, question, like, why? Again, a very long dragged out scene here, but she leaves coffee beans on his grave. Again, what a callback. Again, we end up montaging through their trek to Seattle with typical banter between the two. And we get the scene of them in a tent at night with Dina wanting to talk about their kiss and saying she wants to know how Ellie would rate it, as she's gay and I'm not, which obviously plays into, again, how slowly this Ellie-Dina relationship ends up coming together in the show. And a spot where I know a lot of people were frustrated at Dina, again, being in the closet here. And I do get it for sure, especially considering I don't feel like they handle the culmination of this relationship particularly well. But I get how it can be even more frustrating for people in the LGBTQ community. But I do think there are worlds where they could have ended up making it actually better than the game, but ultimately, again, it ends up being a mixed bag. But also early in the episode, we actually did get a scene seemingly disconnected from everything else, a scene of a group walking down a path near Seattle wearing cloaks, and a lot of focus here on what seems to be a father and daughter within the group, with a lot of exposition here about their group, with it clearly being the Seraphites from the game. But again, weirdly portrayed here in the fact that they talk about how the prophet's been dead for 10 years and now she isn't magic and just a person, which is just, again, a very strange introduction to the Seraphites in a spot where, again, I think we're initially meant to be showing them as very black and white. And it feels like another spot here where they're just taking away that aspect of the game, and more so in utilizing them as a way to make the WLF more intimidating, showing them being scared of the wolves, which is strange to me as well, considering we're later also supposed to be seeing the Seraphites as this like very intimidating group. But again, from this scene, we can see that they're just normal people already. And again, I just feel like as a whole, it just very much shakes up the intentions of the original game in a spot where it's all this, like, again, just a questionable choice to me. But again, it's followed up by Dina and Ellie nearing Seattle, and what do you know? They find a group of dead Seraphites. That's the group from the previous scene. I can't believe it. But again, this scene ends up being used to foreshadow Dina's pregnancy, where this is where we see her puking, which I rightfully called when it happened in the game. Yeah, again, here I feel like also I probably would have had a similar thought if I was not one that played the game, especially in a spot where they also make it very clear that Dina and Jesse had hooked up in the last 3 months as well, where again, it felt kind of obvious that was a thing. But again, this entire scene also just utilized more to set up the WLF as a threat, along with the fact that we get the ending. After we see Ellie and Dina arrive in Seattle, we get a shot of a WLF military truck being followed by soldiers patrolling the streets, along with a pointless cameo from Manny, who's on guard duty, which, again, why was that there? But clearly all this showing, like, Dina and Ellie just being way over their heads, even though they end up not being so, which again weirdly like never ends up falling back on Dina and Ellie here, considering again they never actually truly end up facing much adversity from the WLF themselves. But either way, we get to episode 4, starting off with a flashback here of 2018 Seattle with a caravan of soldiers that are joking around about calling the citizens voters, with us now getting an introduction to Isaac, who again is an antagonist in the main game, in a spot where he ended up coming off very shallow. Like, obviously he was portrayed by Jeffrey Wright, which was a big get for the game, and obviously he plays him here as well, which is cool. But really in general, I feel like Isaac is a character that had potential, was a very intimidating presence in the game, yet just simply had no depth to it. And I did like they actually did more with him in this season. And showing the backstory with WLF here, and showing Isaac being very hypocritical in the modern day. Again, scolding the soldiers for using this phrase. Again, showing him in this scene fighting back against the things that he later embodies. But the scene ends up ultimately culminating in him killing the entire caravan, revealing that he's working alongside Hanrahan, who, again, my initial read on this is like, I feel like she had to be the prophet. It just makes sense that she's a prophet. And this is, again, showing the WLF and the Seraphites working together initially until something broke up. But by the end of the season, we don't get any resolution to this. And it's also in a spot where, like, it doesn't really make sense if that is the case, considering we see Hanrahan more recently in a spot where, again, we got that scene saying that the prophet died 10 years ago. And again, like, I don't know if that's what they're doing anymore with Hanrahan, but it feels like that's a spot where, like, they should have done that. Anyway, we cut back to the modern day with Ellie and Dina scavenging throughout Seattle, with Dina finding something she clearly is going to make use of, and I wonder what that is. Anyway, as they leave, we get the reveal that this is Seattle, day 1, meaning that they are following the same structure as the game, which I'll say again, I'm a bit surprised that they did this, as while I do think the overall structuring of the original game is pretty directly tied to the overall messaging of the game, I did feel like for the show here, I was expecting them to probably do a bit more interlacing between storylines. Not because I think it's better, that I just expected more of Abby showing up at points during season 2. Yeah, again, we didn't get that, which, to be fair, is probably more of a pleasant surprise than anything. Though I do question how they're going to handle season 3, again, especially if there is going to be season 4, of like how much progression there's necessarily going to be. But either way, this entire episode ends up being a really condensed version of day 1 of Ellie's storyline, which again makes a lot of sense considering a lot of that was more gameplay focused. And even then, a lot of the characters that you're hunting down in day 1 and then it being written out of the story at this point anyway. So again, it just felt kind of a no-brainer that, yeah, this is a part of the story that you can very much condense down into just one episode. With them noticing a WLF symbol on the Channel 13 building in the distance, which is their planned destination, during which they end up making a lot of noise, which leads to them realizing that no one's around, which is very convenient and very opposed to what we literally just saw in the previous episode about how overrun it seemed like Seattle was. But either way, it does lead to them taking shelter in a record store, waiting until nighttime to go to the Capitol building. In a spot where we do get the Take On Me scene from the game, a pretty faithful recreation of the game. And I did actually like how it was utilized in the show here. Actually, in a spot where I think this is actually something done better than the game, shockingly. Or while the scene itself is, again, pretty much one for one, I do think the contextualization in the story here makes it a lot more impactful, largely because, again, in the game, it's obviously an optional scene. It's one that ultimately doesn't matter that much. Again, it's a nice scene between Ellie and Dina, but I feel like here now actually ends up being an integral part of the Dina-Ellie relationship, where again, in this world where they're not in a relationship yet, it does lead to this feeling like the moment where Dina realizes that she loves Ellie. And I feel like at least the fact that they were able to utilize this to actually progress the Dina and Ellie relationship, I thought was, again, a nice change here. But as following this, though, we actually do cut back to Isaac, now in the modern day, where he starts rambling on about this quality pan that he's heating up, with the reveal that he's talking to a naked Seraphite who he's interrogating and torturing with the pan. Again, calling him a Scar instead of Seraphite. Again, showing his level of disrespect towards them. Again, showing him being very opposed to how he acted in the flashback. Which, again, I did like this characterization of Isaac. Again, showing him going against his previous ideals, which does make him come off as, again, a compelling villain here. If only he actually did anything on this season. Though, again, I did find it very funny, though, just how blatantly they talk about the cycle of violence and how both sides blame each other. And it's a chicken and the egg, which is like, yeah, I get the point. But again, all this, again, I thought was a pretty good scene in a vacuum, at least. As long as we do see Ellie and Dina entering the Channel 13 building, which plays out pretty similarly to the OG. Again, them finding the lobby filled with hanging WLF bodies, clearly done by the Seraphites, which again, weird how, again, this was a scene utilized to show how dangerous Seraphites are, only for the previous episode to kind of minimize that, but either way, ends up leading to some WLF arriving, looking for some Seraphites, and obviously finding Ellie and Dina instead, where they make their escape pretty similarly to the game, though all this happening at night, which obviously just makes more practical sense that they would want to do this at night. It would make sense that they're able to make their escape at night over the day, instead of just out in broad daylight, but we have them ending up escaping through the tunnels, again, similar to the game, for our next massive infected set piece, which is a really cool visual here, as again the tunnels are lit up in red from the lights from the WLF coming into the room, only for us to end up having a massive horde infected attack, with again this playing very similarly to the OG, with the main difference here coming from how Ellie ends up revealing to Dina about her being immune, where obviously in the game it was through her mask breaking and her breathing in spores, yet here that's not a thing yet. And the way they handle it here is by having Ellie take a bite for Dina, which I will say looked a bit ridiculous, but anyway, they end up escaping through a theater, with Dina clearly being confused here, thinking that Ellie is about to turn, pointing the gun at her, only for Ellie to reveal that she's immune. Tells her to watch her as she sleeps, which is a nice callback to season 1 here. Again, similar to how Joel and Tess watched over her. But this leads to what is probably the more questionable part of this entire episode, where straight up to this point, I thought this was actually a pretty good episode of the show. I actually thought it's an episode that, again, I have very little qualms with. Many of the changes that were made here, I actually thought were either for the better or at least like pretty marginal. And then we get to this following scene where Ellie ends up waking up, again, not infected, so Dina now knows that, leading to Dina not saying a word until she reveals that she's being a very awkward review here, which, to be fair, it kind of is in the game as well. But what makes even more awkward here is that this leads to Dina and Ellie hooking up for the first time, which was a very weird follow-up on this, where obviously in the original game, again, Ellie's reaction to this is a lot more negative, her being upset at Dina. But here, again, this being the lead up to them hooking up for the first time, which is very strange. Where, again, as I said before, I don't mind the idea that they delay the Ellie and Dina relationship, they have it be like a slow burn that culminates around this point in the story. I think the big issue for me is how they end up ultimately handling this reveal, where it just comes off so ridiculous that, again, like Dina just literally says, "I'm pregnant," and then they start making out. And again, it's just like a very strange way to be handling all this, where I really do just question, like, what were they thinking when they wrote this? Like, how'd they not think that this came off very strange? Again, it does lead to a more appropriate scene following this of, like, Dina talking about how sorry she is for how long it took for her, and how her mom told her that she should like boys, and she felt stuck, and again, really playing into this, like, 2003 mindset. But it does lead to, again, the more awkward dialogue here from Ellie, talking about how her, Jesse, and Dina are all having a baby, and how she's going to be a dad, which, again, a lot of the, obviously, like, anti-woke audience got very upset at this, which that's not my personal complaint with this. My personal complaint with this is that this feels ridiculous, because then you literally just hooked up for the first time, which I guess is, again, showing the, like, naivety of Ellie and Dina in this spot. But again, the fact that they're, like, so gung-ho about how they're going to be a family when they've literally just hooked up for the first time, in comparison to, again, the game, where at least it makes more sense there, where they've been together in a romantic relationship for a longer period of time. Again, like, I just feel like the way that the show handles all this is just very awkward. Anyway, we end up hearing the radio turning on, revealing that Nora is at a nearby hospital, which they see in the distance, setting up day 2 with Dina saying that we do this together, and they actually do, which is, again, different from the game. Now, again, a change that I'm not opposed to. I don't really have a vested interest one way or another if Dina goes with Ellie on day 2, but it feels like a lot of the reason for this change was simply because they didn't want to have Ellie alone. As again, that's not very TV friendly to just have Ellie alone walking her way to the hospital. But obviously, just again, a very different approach to how the game handled all this. So it takes us to episode 5, where we get another flashback sequence, but one that doesn't seem to be happening too far in the past, starring Hanrahan interacting with a new character in Elise Park, who doesn't play that much of a factor into the story, though is here really to set up Spores, because they decided to finally add Spores to the story here, largely because I think they felt like they had to if they wanted to keep the Nora scene intact. Again, really showing in Elise being someone that made the ultimate sacrifice, sacrificing her son to seal the Spores under the hospital, which again, it was clearly this contrast, the decision Joel made, where she sacrificed her son, and it's what where Joel didn't. But again, really outside that, I don't feel like it really adds that much depth here. And really in general, again, this is the scene that I'm talking about where like I really don't get what they're doing with Hanrahan then. Again, if this is a scene that is literally happening this year, again, it's clear that she's probably not the prophet, because the prophet died 10 years ago, which again makes you question like what is the point of Hanrahan then. But with that, we then cut back to Ellie and Dina with the reveal that it's Seattle day 2, where we see Dina again listening to the radio to create a plan. Oh, while Ellie walks into the auditorium alone, picking up a guitar and starts to play Future Days, which is a little bit weird in the sense that obviously we haven't been introduced to Future Days yet, but again, they paid this off in the following episode, so it's not a major complaint. But again, she starts playing the beginning of the song only to stop, which again, similar to the OG, and again, is perfect as is. Again, showing how much of an attachment she has to the song because of Joel, also shows her struggle to even play it because of her connection to Joel. And showing her still dealing with Joel's death and how much of an impact that had on her, which is something that Craig Mazin wanted to ruin. Where again, I generally don't understand this decision where Craig Mazin, again, supposedly originally wanted Ellie to play the entirety of the song and have Dina walk in on it, which is like, again, literally what you did the last episode with Take On Me, but also it's a terrible narrative decision anyway. Where, I mean, like, I've obviously not really talked about this much over the course of this review, but I really don't like Craig Mazin's direction of The Last of Us. Or while I do think he gets the general idea and the themes of The Last of Us, I do think the way he executes on them are just in a way that I simply just do not like. I think he's just a lot more blatant in his overall approach to storytelling in a spot where, again, I just don't personally like it. And again, this in particular, though, I think is just such a boneheaded decision. Like, I just generally cannot understand how someone with a functioning brain can think that this is a good idea to have Ellie literally playing the entire song. But either way, again, Dina creates a plan and they go off together, leading to Dina telling her backstory, talking about how her mom and sister were killed and that she killed the person that did so, with this, again, obviously trying to lead back into her motivations for wanting revenge for Joel, which is funny considering she literally goes back against this in the following episode. But obviously through all this, we do skip the entire Hillcrest section of the game, which again makes full sense. I mean, it's a section of the game that really doesn't have much narrative purpose outside of introducing Jesse, which they obviously do in a different way here. Because again, the entire section is you following Tommy's trail only to not find Tommy, where again, this ends up mostly following the Seraphites chapter of the game where they're heading out to the hospital, though mixing in aspects of Hillcrest and the fact that they do reintroduce Jesse here, though following an attack by stalkers, which is another boring action sequence. But again, Jesse ends up being revealed here as having followed them alongside Tommy, which again, minor shakeup there. As in the original, again, he went alone, Tommy went before him, but also they do really play into the Joel fake out here in a spot where, again, that was a funny aspect of the original games. I think that's so many people pissed off about. They faked you out in the trailer thinking it was Joel that rescued Ellie, only for obviously in the game Joel to already be dead and it was Jesse instead. And here they end up fully playing into that by just seeing like a blurry image save Ellie initially, again, one that looks like Joel, only for it to obviously turn out to be Jesse instead. And obviously, again, they do a lot more in the show focus around Jesse as this like parallel for Joel, which I think makes all this appropriate anyway. But anyway, we see him escaping through the park, what ends up being a similar set piece to the game, though now with Jesse and Dina alongside Ellie, and seeing them watch a man get tortured, which again just continues the weird conflicting messages about the Seraphites across the season. But either way, they get detected and end up getting split up, and in the escape, Dina gets shot in the leg to take her out of commission for A3, but also again just continues to show Ellie's obsession or revenge, the fact that she doesn't go back to help Dina, and instead just proceeds to the hospital. And though I do find it strange how we just like pretty much straight up cut to Ellie just holding up Nora, which again, obviously, again, there's not really that much to show from a TV perspective where a lot of it was gameplay in the game, but still, it's funny how she just like sneaks her way into the hospital unfettered. But anyway, it plays out similarly to the game, similar chase sequence throughout the hospital, similar falling down the elevator shaft into spores, with Ellie surviving due to her immunity and ends up finding Leon, Elise's son from earlier. She's like, who the fuck cares? But either way, we got a similar Nora death scene, though slightly different situation. How I do feel like Ellie comes off a lot more cold here, like openly saying that she doesn't care about what Joel did and knows what he did. Also, I didn't like how they like openly just told Ellie about Abby's father, and Ellie just seeming to know already, which I guess is again supposed to be this reveal of how much Ellie actually knows about this entire situation, which really gets expanded on in the next episode. But again, I still feel like this continues to take away from the game's original message, where I don't think Ellie is supposed to know Abby's backstory, and I think the fact that she is aware of that and still lacks any semblance of empathy for her is something that, again, I don't love being added to the story here, even though, again, it continues to add on to this like obsession for revenge from Ellie, but it's also a spot where it feels like it takes away a bit from the overall lesson Ellie is supposed to learn by the end. Though here we do see Ellie coming off a lot more primal in her killing of Nora. Technically, she doesn't kill Nora, she leaves her for dead, but either way. Where in the OG, it felt like she was pushing herself into doing this, that this wasn't the normal for her, and it was her grief from Joel's death that really pushed her into doing this. Where here, because of this new characterization for Ellie, this is just a thing Ellie does. Again, that's something that, again, I've always looked back on, even back in season 1 when they were setting this up as something that I just don't think worked for part 2. And to me, again, I still agree with that. I don't feel like the scene is nearly as impactful. It just feels like something Ellie would do anyway. It doesn't feel like she's being forced to do this because of her grief over Joel's death. She's doing this because this is just who Ellie is. But we ultimately do end the episode here, cutting the black with Ellie being woken up by Joel, with this clearly being a flashback, and we hear Pearl Jam playing, which I wonder if that'll play a factor. We're gonna get to episode 6, which is almost entirely in flashbacks, with this more so giving us the full context around the Joel and Ellie relationship at this point, fully conceptualizing what happened over the last 5 years, which again, I think is a great episode on paper, though I do question some of the decisions made with this episode. But anyway, we do start off with the flashback in 1983, with us seeing Joel and Tommy's childhoods, because I definitely needed this. Again, showing Joel trying to protect Tommy by lying to their dad about him being the one that tried to buy drugs instead of Tommy, so their dad would beat him up instead of Tommy. To which to that, like, fuck off. Like, I get it. I get Joel's a protector. You don't need to fucking say it every fucking time. Though that being said, I do think there's something good conceptually to come from this, in the fact that we do see him talking to his dad, with his dad talking about getting beaten up as a kid himself, and he's doing better than his father did, and says, when it's your turn, I hope you do a little better than me, which is something that clearly we passed off onto Ellie, which again, I think is good conceptually. Again, good, this idea of this like generational growth here. I think my issue with all this is how it feels like this is literally just thrown in here for that in this episode, with it just feeling like a kind of forced scene to me, to just add that one line later in the story in a spot where, again, it just doesn't feel necessary. It just feels like another thing that Craig Mazin just like came up with his head of, oh, this would be a great line, how about we create an entire scene based around it. But again, the rest of the episode ends up passing through the years, stopping on each of Ellie's birthdays, which is very convenient that all this stuff ends up happening on Ellie's birthday each time. But we do start off with Joel ordering a cake from Seth, because also we see him building Ellie's guitar, only for Tommy to arrive, with Ellie revealing that she burned her arm, obviously to hide her bite, in a spot where, why is she doing this on her birthday? But also, like, really funny how this is followed by Joel giving her a cake, with the reveal that Seth wrote her name wrong, putting Eli, because I guess he's really incompetent. But all this ends up turning into the Future Days scene, with Joel giving her a guitar with similar dialogue. And again, really funny how like the idea that Future Days is in this world isn't practical, because again, the song came out in 2013, which at least was the year of the quarantine, which at least was the year it all started in the game, while here, obviously, it happened in 2003, meaning that the song existing doesn't make sense, but obviously that's not really a major issue. It's more so a nitpick, and again, there's no way they weren't going to put the song in the show. Again, it's such a perfect song that really encapsulates the entire themes of the entire story anyway. And again, like, it being in this specific spot, I don't have major gripes with. I do think I probably would have preferred it to be earlier in the story, like it was in the OG, especially to add more depth to that scene of Ellie in the auditorium as it's happening, but ultimately it doesn't really matter too much. But then we cut to 1 year later, which is clearly the birthday gift chapter from the game, which plays out similar to the game, though instead on the way there they mix in dialogue from the Finding Strength chapter, because they eradicated that chapter entirely, with Joel again thinking that Ellie has a thing for Jesse, which again he's wrong about, and that gets expanded on later. But also later we get the again same dinosaur scene, followed by Ellie pretending to go into space, and all stuff from the original game. Again, all just fine sequences here. Obviously just taking out the gameplay section with the boar following this, which again makes sense that they did that, and instead have Ellie noticing fireflies in the distance as they leave, which again has the same impact there. Either way, just a scene that's supposed to show Joel and Ellie being happy together, only to be this tension every time Ellie's reminded of the Fireflies. But anyway, we then cut to 1 year later from that, where Joel arrives home early from patrol, barges into Ellie's room to find her hooking up with Kat and smoking pot and getting a tattoo to cover the burn, with Joel being outraged here, saying she's doing all the teenage stuff at once, upset at her for experimenting with girls, only for Ellie to say it's not an experiment. And all this is like so strange here. And with, again, us having to have Joel come off as openly homophobic here, which obviously makes sense considering this is a 2003 world. And ultimately he ends up being supportive of Ellie and Dina by the end, but I did find it strange how the show ends up like focusing around this. But also in general, I really did not like how any of this is truly handled. Like, I really do not like the focus here on this like typical teenage drama that leads into fracturing in their relationship, which obviously isn't the actual reality, as obviously the truth in causing the relationship to fracture here is this underlying distrust between the two over what happened beforehand. And again, you can assume this stuff happened in the OG as well, that in this 5-year gap, again, there were disagreements between the two over how Ellie was acting. But I think the fact that we're being shown it here is something I really don't like. Again, to me, it just, again, further minimizes the importance of Joel's lie as the cause of their strike, to where, while again, it is this underlying issue, I do think having scenes like this just makes it feel like it's things like this that cause these issues between Joel and Ellie, which again just kind of muddies the waters to me in the spot where, again, I felt like the actual flashback sequences were a lot more focused and how they focus simply on the direct ramifications of Joel's lie. Where I feel like with the way this is portrayed, it's like, okay, Joel's lie happened, but also Ellie's a teenager, and that's what caused them to fall apart, which again, I just don't particularly like how they all ended up handling all this. But again, Lisa, Ellie deciding to move into the garage, Joel ending up agreeing, and him noticing Ellie's obsession with moths, with him saying it's a symbol for change and growth, only to go to Gale and realize that it actually signifies death, which I found all this really funny. As again, it really feels like them trying to put purpose on something that was not purposeful initially, where Neil himself has said that the myth that the moth symbolism was unintentional in the games, only from, again, trying to make this big moment here out of it. But either way, we cut to 2 years later with Ellie's last birthday from the current timeline, with Joel taking her on her first patrol, though first, we do have to see Ellie reciting what she wants to ask Joel about what happened at Salt Lake City, which, again, how's this not come up earlier? Well, again, I think that's another thing that I don't particularly like about how the show handles it. She waits, again, like almost 5 years to start even questioning Joel in this instance, where, again, you compare to the OG, and she takes initiative 2 years later. But in this spot, she never actually ends up taking the initiative to do anything about this. Again, it just feels like she's a lot less proactive about figuring out about the lie in the show, which is something I don't particularly like. But either way, they end up going down the safest trail, only still hear affected nearby, only to find Eugene, who's there bitten, which I personally found underwhelming in how they overall handled this Eugene storyline. While at the end of the day, I don't think it's bad. I actually think they end up tying it to the story relatively well. I personally was more so expecting Eugene to be more directly tied to Joel's lie, in that Eugene, again, as a former Firefly, could have potentially found out the truth about what Joel did, and because that Joel feeling like he needs to kill him to silence him, which again would have been this more brutal result there. Well, I feel like what we got here, again, is still fine. It feels like a more basic approach to the story being told here, again, just having him get affected, and Joel making a similar promise to Ellie as earlier, again, promising not to kill Eugene in this spot, allowing Eugene to go back to Jackson, say his goodbyes to Gale, which again, he frantically ends up pleading for, which obviously Joel ends up turning back on, killing Eugene anyway, again, showing him killing Eugene to protect his community, because that's a thing we need to be reiterated across the story, and fully playing into Joel's previous lie, but not in a direct way, to where, again, I am largely content with how they handled this now, though I think my initial reaction to this was being a bit annoyed how indirectly connected this seemed to be. But again, he ends up proceeding to lie to Gale, saying he died bravely, only for Ellie to expose his lie, saying that you swore, as she leaves, which again, I did find very funny personally. But again, I get what they're doing here, obviously, like, clearly implying she's talking about the ending of season 1 over this situation that just happened, and clearly knowing that he's been lying at this point, even though she's obviously been assuming this up to this point anyway. But what I do find strange about all this is that we then cut to 9 months later, aka the night of the dance, which is where everything seems to come to a head, which is obviously different from the OG game, where, yeah, we do see the dance from Joel's perspective, him having a convo with Maria to give her some screen time again, and ultimately seeing him push Seth, only for it to lead into the patio scene, which again, I was shocked we even got it in this season. The fact that this happened so early in the show's run was surprising, though I guess it's supposed to be this like kind of farewell to Joel at this point. But again, a pretty faithful recreation of that scene at the beginning, until you realize that this scene is being done with Ellie still never having it actually been confirmed to her that Joel lied. Again, leading to them mixing in the patio scene with the hospital scene from the game, which to me does not work. It ends up being a lot less impactful for me. Now, again, it's not a bad scene on paper. I think people not attached to the part 2, I think probably do come out of this thinking this is one of the best scenes of the entire season. Yet for me, I just personally did not like how they approached this. Now, that being said, I do think the original handling of the hospital scene was, again, very sloppy. I do think the notion that Ellie just took off on her own to go to Salt Lake City, which is a bit silly, but I do think I would have preferred her finding out still before this moment itself, where I think mixing in the two scenes, like, to me just feels like so much is going on in this one conversation. I would have liked Ellie to have a bit more time to process all this, and to be fair, again, she has, right? Because, like, clearly she already knew that this was what happened. She's getting it confirmed at this point, but I do think I would have liked there to actually be more blatant distance between the two, because she outwardly knows that this is what happened. And along with that, again, I also still feel like some of the new dialogue here was just, again, a bit cringy in typical TV show fashion. Again, her saying, I think I knew already. I knew this whole time. And saying that you took that from me. You took that from everyone. Where again, like, I get it. You don't have to fucking say it. Where again, it just feels like they're taking lines from the original and then like expanding on it because they're like, hey, we want you to make sure you know what they're saying. And again, like the funniest thing to me is like later when Joel says that I would do it all over again, which again, one of my favorite lines in the entire OG game, only for him to then proceed to say, he did it because I love you, which it's like, no fucking shit. I didn't need you to say that. And obviously they didn't have to end this all with the line from earlier of him saying that if you were to ever have one of your own, I hope you do a little better to me, which again feels like set up to like Ellie eventually becoming a parent in probably season 4 at this point. Again, the scene just feels a bit contrived in how it's implemented here, just feeling like they just added that scene just to have that line here. Also, just a very strange ending to this entire scene here, and the fact that we don't even see Joel's reaction to Ellie saying, I don't think I can forgive you, but I'd like to try, which again was such a powerful moment in the game to see Joel just being so like relieved saying like that. Again, that gets entirely taken out of the show here, which I do question why. Again, that's essentially the end of the episode, as we then end the episode on a final shot of Ellie just walking towards the theater, taking us to the finale, which I'll say very much did not really feel like a finale, where obviously, again, this is just the midway point in Last of Us Part 2. They're obviously splitting this into 2 or 3 seasons now. Again, this is always going to feel like a mid-season finale, and with that, I should also mention the fact that obviously the season's only 7 episodes long, which is obviously very short in the grand scheme of things, but again, a lot of that just felt like he's thinking they want to drag out the show as much as possible. But again, we start off with a scene of Jesse and Dina at the theater, with Jesse tending to Dina's injury, and you can't let me die, and says no to alcohol, and which again leads to Jesse figuring out she's pregnant, I guess. But again, Ellie ends up arriving right after, leading to the scene of Dina washing off Ellie that we got in the game. Though this time, with Ellie deciding to tell Dina the reality of what Joel did and how he killed Abby's father for some reason. I don't know why she's doing this, but also I don't really get Dina's reaction to this also, where I get the notion of, again, she thinks that Ellie lied to her in the way that Joel lied to Ellie, but the fact that, again, like this seems to just like completely change Dina's motivations here, where again, up to this point she was just like all in on wanting revenge and killing Abby, and just now because of this knowledge she just stops, which I guess is again like kind of showing her as this contrast to Ellie, the fact that she at least had this empathy to up all this while Ellie doesn't. But again, just feels like a spot where like to me this felt a bit contrived, again just feeling like them trying to cause a fracture between the two, and again just didn't particularly feel consistent to me. But either way, we get the reveal that's Seattle Day 3. I can't believe it, where Ellie goes out with Jesse to find Tommy, aka literally what happens in the game, while Dina's stuck holding fort because of her injury, aka mainly the reason why she probably got injured is to leave her there to begin with. But again, we end up seeing Jesse and Ellie talk with similar dialogue to the game, with Jesse finding out that Dina's pregnant and really scolding Ellie here for her recklessness, putting them into a war zone. But I do a lot of setup here of like setting up Jesse as his antithesis to Ellie, also as his parallel to Joel, showing him holding Ellie back, all while they see the WLF torture a Seraphite, and showing Jesse trying to protect his community, even at the sacrifice of others, where again, just kind of Joel-like in that way, which again, just weird considering how much focus we got on how Joel and Ellie are the same. Yet here they're clearly meant to be contrasted, but either way, we also do cut to a conversation between Elise and Isaac, as Isaac prepares an attack on Scar Island, with Isaac asking, is there any word on Abby? Alluding to Abby having gone missing. Obviously setting up what season 3 is going to be. Also leading to Isaac talking about how great of a soldier she is and how she was intended to lead once he's gone, which is this very weird scene here to have, especially when there's like little characterization of Abby, which like I don't hate this like more like direct connected tissue between Isaac and Abby. That seems to be implied here, but again, I just feel like it's weird to do all this when like we barely seen Abby at all. And likely this relationship between two would have been set up in season 3 anyway. I personally don't feel like the scene needed to be here, but either way, we see Jesse and Ellie enter a bookstore, leading to Jesse talking about his relationship with Dina, saying that he loves her, but not in the same way Ellie does, going off on this story about how he fell in love with the girl that was visiting Jackson and that he didn't go with her because he was committed to his community, and which again just feels like further development of Jesse, all of them also trying to kind of like soften the blow for when Ellie and Dina get together, I guess. But ultimately, they end up pinpointing Tommy's location, only for Ellie to see the aquarium where she thinks Abby's located in the distance and wants to go after her instead of rescuing Tommy, leading to Jesse now revealing that he voted no on the proposal to go to Seattle because they had to reinforce that point again. Oh, he's all for the community, but again, Ellie ends up getting outraged here, saying fuck the community. And again, they end up splitting apart, very similar to the game itself, but it does lead to Ellie, again, also like the game, stealing a boat in the middle of the storm, all the WLF first starting their assault on Scar Island, only for the boat to capsize like in the game, and clearly she ends up landing on the shore of the aquarium, as she should, except she doesn't. Where for some reason they decided to have her land on Scar Island, which is so stupid, as again, this is literally the dumbest scene the entire season, which is so funny considering this is literally a scene that was meant to be in the game and they cut it from the game, realizing how dumb it was there, only for them to still put it in the show. Like, I generally don't understand. Again, it's just so ridiculous here to see her being captured by Seraphites and them almost hanging her, only for them to let her go because Haven's under attack, which just makes no sense. Like, why would they just not kill her? It takes like 2 seconds to do that. And again, just leaves her getting back on the boat and just riding off to the aquarium anyway, where all this is just so stupid. But either way, we get to the aquarium where she finds Owen and Mel, with them having a similar conversation to in the game, with Owen wanting to go after Abby. And again, Ellie similarly holding them up, only to end up killing Owen, again, in a similar way. So they end up changing up Mel's death here in a way that I thought was really fucking stupid. Where in the game, again, Mel ends up attacking Ellie and ends up killing her in self-defense, which, to be fair, feels a little bit out of character for Mel. But here they decide to have Ellie just accidentally kill Mel by having the bullet that killed Owen grazing her in the neck, leading to her bleeding out, which was so stupid. This looks so ridiculous. Like, why'd they do this? It just felt so cheesy here. And then follow this up with like, but also again, we get the reveal that Mel was pregnant. We get like her begging Ellie to help deliver the baby before she dies, which again, I get what they're going for. Again, making this baby's death more impactful by having Ellie fail to save her in a spot where she could have. But again, I just felt like the execution of the scene again just came off so ridiculous to me. And I really just felt like Mel's death here and the realization that she's pregnant again came off less impactful for me in the show here, where I really love how the game handles this, again, it being this like piercing noise at this moment, where the way that all this ends up playing out just felt kind of funny. But ultimately we get the same scene back at the theater as they prepare to go home, with Ellie at least saying that she's willing to let Abby go. And we do get a lot of talk here about how good of a person Jesse is, because he went back to save Ellie, only for him to hear rumbling in the lobby, and really ends up turning out exactly like the game. Jesse just being killed instantly as they walk through the doors, where again, as much as I mock how much they reiterated the same style of content with Jesse in these last couple episodes, I did actually feel like it did a pretty effective job at making Jesse's death feel a lot more impactful, with again, him being set up as like the next leader for Jackson, considering his relationships with Ellie and Dina. I did feel like Jesse, again, ultimately ended up feeling like a much more complete character by the end here. And again, I think it makes his death a lot more tragic in that light. Oh, again, we get the same resolution to this scene. We get the same, I let you live and you wasted it, with again, Caitlin Dever doing a very good job in this scene here. We do get a little bit more at the end of this scene than we did in the game, where in the game it cuts immediately after she says that. Here, it does cut to black, but we still hear Ellie yelling out no, and Abby pulling the trigger, which is, again, weird in a sense that I think they're clearly trying to fake you out into thinking that Ellie's dead, which obviously that's not happening. But again, we then cut to the final scene of the season of Abby waking up, being woken up by Manny in a similar way to what happened in the game, with her proceeding to overlook the stadium, with the word Seattle Day 1 coming on screen, with it obviously being very clear at this point that season 3 is largely going to be revolving around Abby, at least in the beginning of it. And again, a fine conclusion here. Obviously, there were two approaches to end this season. You could have ended it with the I let you live and you wasted it scene, which in that world, I don't think you would have a good sense of what is to come at that point. Though I think it'd also be very frustrating when you get to season 3 and you just realize right away that, oh, we're not getting that, and we're instead getting a lot of Abby. To where I do think ending it on this scene, again, at least sets expectations in 3 that yes, we're going to get a lot of Abby. Though it in itself isn't as good of a cliffhanger, but still, again, a solid way to conclude the season. And again, kind of expected way to conclude the season. Especially once we found out they were keeping the original structure of the game, it kind of just felt like this was obviously natural endpoint for the season. I'm interested in seeing where it goes to season 3. As much as I criticize the show, and I'm sure I'll have the same issues as we go along, I am interested in seeing how they overall handle the Abby storyline, particularly because, again, a lot of my complaints about how the show has handled part 2 so far are not particularly complete yet, as I feel like a lot of the criticisms I have largely come from the idea that I'm still a bit unsure where exactly all this is going. So while, again, it does seem like they're overall trying to tell the same story as part 2, I could see a world where they're not telling the exact same story as part 2, slightly shifting on that. And I think through that could recontextualize my thoughts on this season, where again, unlike season 1, where obviously season 1 is its own complete separate individual story, I feel like season 2 here is a spot where it gets obviously only half of the story, if not a third, which we'll see how that's out. But again, I think there's a lot more room for my opinion of season 2 to go up over time, depending on how they handle Abby's storyline, if they again kind of shift the messaging of the remainder of the story, but still a spot where I just in general don't think this should have existed. I just feel like Last of Us Part 2 is a story that just needs to be a video game, at least to be told in the way that it was initially intended. Where for me personally, I just feel like if they are literally just doing what the game did, but just adding their own flair to it, I just feel like to me, this just does not come off as a satisfying way to handle the story from my point of view. But to actually get the full conclusion to that, again, we'll kind of have to wait and see what happens with future seasons. With that, those are my thoughts on Last of Us Season 2. Again, season, I thought it was just kind of fine by the end. I think in terms of just raw quality, I do think Season 1 is better than Season 2. Though while I obviously have my complaints with Season 1, I probably actually have more complaints with Season 1 than I do with Season 2. I do feel like the overall raw material of Season 1 is obviously just a lot stronger than Season 2. I do think, again, my general opinion of Season 2 is something that is, again, very subject to change, while my opinion of Season 1 is probably not, considering I obviously know what they were doing there. Though, again, still not a bad show. Again, as much as I do rip on the TV show, I don't think this is a bad show on paper, especially if you're so disconnected from the original series. I do think The Last of Us is still a very well-made television show with, again, great acting, and still fully realized themes, still pretty strong writing, even though, again, I think it could be better and has been done better. But either way, again, those are my opinions on Last of Us Season 2. Again, Season 3 is coming at some point. Maybe I'll cover it. We'll see. I'll get straight up, I probably will. But I'll say that. I'll just expect more of the same style content on the channel. I don't know how much scripted media videos I'll necessarily be doing from this point forward. But in terms of reality TV, you can expect those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.